Involvement with the criminal justice system is life-changing. It matters.
Having a justice system that works is a really important part of a democratic society.
I'm Penelope Gibbs, Director of Transform Justice.
I'm Rob Allen. I've worked in and around criminal justice all my career.
This is the Transform Justice podcast, throwing light on the criminal justice system.
Hearing from people who know.
It's about whether the system's fair.
And what can be done to make it better.
Hello. Today we return to a subject we've touched on before, the way justice is meted out in our magistrates' courts. Transform Justice has just published the latest report on the experiences of volunteers who last year watched proceedings in London's 14 magistrates' courts. To discuss what they found, Rob Allen and I are joined by Rosemin Najmudin, one of the hard-working courtwatchers, and by Jessica Jacobson, Professor of Criminal Justice at Birkbeck, University of London.
So, Penelope, you set up the CourtWatch project at Transform Justice. What did you think the point was of having a kind of mass court observation project?
It actually arose from a few things. In the United States, volunteers go into courts and watch what's happening and write reports about it and so on. And we were really intrigued. And the other thing is a sort of feeling that the reality of what is happening in the magistrates' courts is pretty difficult to know. So they don't record them. There is no filming ever done there. So it's like a closed space unless somebody literally goes in and watches what's going on. And there are very few journalists who now regularly go into magistrates' courts. So the idea was to send volunteers into London's magistrates' courts to watch what was going on, write it down, and kind of, as it were, report it back to us so we could see what the patterns were. And so we first did that in 2023, and we published 3 reports on the basis of that. And then we ran it again, and we had more volunteers, and we had, in the end, over 2,000 hearings, which we could analyse. And then we didn't predict it in 2023, but there's now been a big government move to look at the courts and particularly backlogs in the courts. And the idea that the government is putting forward is that cases which currently actually get, for the most part, dealt with in the Crown Court should instead be kept down into the magistrates' courts. I mean, lots of cases. So it actually has an added piquancy, this evidence that we've got now, because these are the courts that they want to put more work in. And actually, what the observers told us was that they were blooming inefficient as it is.
Well, Rosemin, you're one of the observers. You volunteered to be part of this CourtWatch programme. What prompted you to want to do it?
I think, to be honest, fear. I have a really scary vision of the courts and a little bit of experience in the family courts, which made me really afraid. So in a way, I think it was the therapy. I went to the induction and it was so friendly and gentle and kind.
So this was an induction that Transform Justice held for the volunteers to tell you what to expect and so on?
Yeah, it was just more information sharing, and then we had court watchers present, and I thought, just go to one and see what happens. And I became addicted very quickly.
So you hadn't been in a magistrates' court before?
I did go into Westminster magistrates' courts previously. I had, I think, seen one little 5-minute thing, but I didn't remember it very well.
But this is quite an interesting reason to volunteer. So it's like people have fear of spiders and they get exposed to them. You thought, my fear of courts should be something that I should try and overcome through going into the court.
Yes, and also just because I thought things have to change. Something that's about fairness and justice can't make somebody like me, I'm generally quite confident. And if it makes me feel like this, I think I can input and just start maybe to effect change. I mean, I thought it was a big aim. I didn't actually think it would happen. But once I started doing CourtWatch, I really felt listened to and having a little bit of a voice, and just being very, very shocked by my experience and what I saw, good and bad.
We'll get into a bit more detail about what Rosemin saw. But Jessica, it is quite unusual, the CourtWatch programme. Do you think there is a value in courts being observed by people who are not involved in the case and are not academics?
Yes, absolutely. We know that open justice is seen as an important principle of justice. It's seen as very essential to access to justice. And without people, the public, going into courts, scrutinising what's going on, what does open justice actually mean? And CourtWatch is really a way of putting the principle of open justice into practice.
But there aren't many people who do go into the courts who are not involved in the case in any way, are there?
Absolutely, and especially not the magistrates' courts. I think people are much more aware of what goes on in Crown Court. If anybody is perhaps thinking of going to a court, they think of going to the Crown Court. Also in the Crown Court you have juries, so you have members of the public there in that capacity. But magistrates' court is much more overlooked.
I mean, CourtWatch was about all London magistrates' courts. Rosemin, you in fact visited more than one. Why did you want to visit more than one? And were they all equally welcoming and accessible?
So initially, I just Googled and saw a court in Greenwich and found it's all video and tribunals and that kind of thing, so not accessible at all. So because I live in South East London, I just went to West Croydon, and I just had an experience, and I thought this can't be the general experience of London.
What happened?
So I cycle everywhere, and they made a big fuss about my bike, that it could be a bomb. There were no signs, like in the city, they says, don't leave your bike here. There must be cameras or something, because somebody,
came up to you and
came
said,
outside and said, can't leave it anywhere around the courts. I had to walk miles to leave my bike, and then I was afraid the whole day somebody would steal it. I felt like the security and the admin staff had a lot of power, and they were determined to, I felt, put me down. But I started off going into the court, even though I was not involved personally in a case, really tense, really stressed out. And I don't get like that at all. And I was just thinking, gosh, is this how defendants feel, or witnesses? And then going into the building, same experience. The staff had a lot of power, really nitpicking. I think we had to drink the water.
What, to test that it wasn't something...
It wasn't, I don't know what, like the aeroplanes. And really picking through everything, like sanitary towels for some people, just really humiliating. And then I was thinking, which case? Trying to make my mind up. And I took a picture of the listings. I know. And it was like as if I had a bomb. All these stuff came from all over the place,
Really?
Yeah. So I did everything wrong, I suppose, unintentionally.
Well, but I just think that is crazy, because the fact is you can get court lists online.
This is what I couldn't understand.
So literally there were several people who came around you.
And really made me delete in front of them, check my phone. Was it deleted in the delete folder? I did persevere. I went for a couple of CourtWatch sessions at the Croydon Court. And, some of the cases were really well run, but just something niggled, just get more experience. And I kind of got hooked a bit. Going as an observer, when you're not personally involved, people ignore you. I couldn't believe the conversations people would have, even in Croydon, very personal. And I just thought, should I be here? Shouldn't somebody come and tell me it's too private? But
I think that is part of open justice, but it's interesting because previous court watchers have had that concern a bit. Can I say I'm a bit disappointed about Croydon and your reception there, because actually it was one of the courts that was observed in 2023 by many, many court watchers. So you would have hoped that they would have actually improved their welcome through kind of reading what CourtWatch has said. It's interesting.
Did anybody ask you what you were doing there?
Many, many times, sometimes quite rude. In West Croydon, you're in the courtroom, it's tiny, and you sit in the back rows, and sort of people look at you. But a couple of judges asked me, who are you, what you're doing here? And they asked everyone.
I mean, Jessica, you've observed a variety of different courts and tribunals. during your research over the years, not just magistrates, many others as well. In your experience, do some feel more open to people coming in than others?
Individual courts vary widely, and you might be met with more suspicion in one than another. I mean, generally, if I go into court, I will explain I'm there as a researcher. Sometimes a member of court staff will say, let me just check if that's okay, which if it's a criminal court, they shouldn't be checking. You have the right to sit there. They've always come back and said that's fine. We have observed in courts that aren't open to the public, such as the family court and the youth court, and there we've had to get special permissions. In places like tribunals, and I've also done some observations in coroners' courts where inquests into unnatural deaths are held. In those settings, staff are very unused to having anybody coming in who's not involved in the case. And generally, I've found they're very welcoming. They quite like the fact that somebody's showing an interest, and you're a bit of a novelty as an observer. It will often also be assumed that you're a journalist if you're sitting in court taking notes. And if you're sitting with defendants' families or other members of the public, they will often assume you're a journalist. Sometimes we've said we're researchers, we're from a university, because there might be some hostility towards journalists.
But do you think there's a difference in what happens in the court if they know you're there, as it were, with a special purpose?
We have sometimes suspected that there is what you can call an observer effect. If we're in court, sometimes we will also talk to judges or magistrates to explain what we're doing. Most of our research is about what it's like to go to court as a defendant or witness or other member of the public. We say we're interested in what helps people participate in court hearings, and we have sometimes then watched judges or magistrates take particular care to explain proceedings.
They're on
in
their
the
best
court
behaviour
itself.
when you're
So, yeah, I mean, very difficult to say, of course, but we have sometimes felt there has been some effect of us being there.
Rosemin, do you think that anybody you watched changed their behaviour because they knew you were watching them?
I would agree. Only, though, very few. Usually it was a single district judge. So one particularly made eye contact and smiled, made a point of reassuring me, which I thought was kind. And they were the better judge, you know, the way they treated the defendants. Generally, though, nobody cared.
Rosemin, once you got into the courtroom, I mean, how easy was it to follow what was going on, what the cases were about?
It varied. Like Monday was chaotic. People had been arrested in a police station, hadn't been heard on a Saturday, so they'd been in prison Sunday, Monday. They were very in ragged clothes, same clothes. Then you'd have 4 or 5 solicitors trying to say, hear my case first or adjourn it because something is missing. Sometimes you would have a duty solicitor who had several cases and he was running between different courts. To me, it was chaos. Once they decided what they were going to hear, it calmed down. But there were times when nothing happened before 11:30. And then it was like, oh, it's 12:30. Maybe we should adjourn for lunch. It just felt, it's like, my goodness, this is justice. I was really gobsmacked. But Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, generally it seemed better organised.
Yeah. I mean, some of your colleague court watchers say that they sometimes found it quite difficult to actually hear what was going on. Was that an issue for you or no?
Often. I think defendants are so nervous. They're very quiet. People mumble. The solicitors have their backs to you. So if they're not really well-mic'd, and you could see the defendant had no idea what was going on. They were just in a corner, totally unaware of discussions about their own case and treatment.
So you think they had the same difficulty hearing as you did?
100%, yeah. They were not participants often. 50%, I think. It was shocking.
Were most of these defendants in a secure dock when they were there? Did that make it more difficult for them to hear and participate, do you think?
Yes, 100%. And the funniest case I saw was this, I can't even gauge his age, I would say 50s, 60s. And he would come and touch the screen. Almost his ear was on the Perspex screen as if that would improve his hearing. And the judge kept saying, please sit down. It was this constant yo-yo. People were treated, if they'd come from remand and they were in like a tracksuit, they were definitely treated differently to somebody who you could see had never been in court and were very upset, or were in court because of a family member. They had not actually done anything.
So worse. You're talking about the one in the tracksuit.
Were treated much worse. The other people were often asked to come and sit just outside the dock. So like if you were well dressed, and you'd just come because some little mistake, something to do with housing or a little bit.
But do you think it was to do with the issue they were there for, or the way they were dressed?
Both. Yeah, and if somebody was particularly upset, but not in a tracksuit, they would be allowed to sit out. But it doesn't matter how upset you were. If you had been on remand, they never took you from the docks. And one or two times it was the security guards sitting next to them who were so decent, like explaining and just saying, calm down, making them sit.
Yeah. Jessica, this issue of court users finding it hard to understand and hear what's going on, have you seen and heard about that in the kind of work you've done?
Very much. It's been a consistent theme, but it's particularly noticeable, I think, with defendants, exactly as you've described it, Rosemin, where on the one hand, the case is all about the defendant. It's about what they've done or haven't done. If they're convicted, it's about what sentence is appropriate for them. And yet they're often very, very far removed from proceedings. They're watching, they're observing, they're not a participant. And when we've talked to defendants about their experiences, often that's how they've described it. And they've said they didn't understand what was going on. They say things like all the long words, long words you never hear before that were used, finding it difficult to hear, finding it difficult to communicate with their lawyers. Again, with the dock, they're usually situated at the back of the court, facing their lawyers' backs who are facing the judge. I've also seen lawyers come over to the dock to consult with their client. And sometimes the perspex, it's kind of slats, and they'll be trying to kind of speak between the gaps and the slats so they can hear each other.
In the perspex?
Yeah, so they're kind of awkwardly trying to speak through those. And it's just not conducive to a system or process where those on trial are actually able to participate.
So when you've watched magistrates' courts, is the dock the norm?
Yes, it seems to be the default.
I would agree. Majority of the defendants I saw were male and often black male. But when you had like an older mother or a white or of Indian origin or East European, for some reason they were allowed to sit near the dock but just outside. So I think race played a part.
I mean, presumably, Jessica, people aren't deliberately being kept in a position where they can't understand. Is it just a sort of a byproduct of the system we've got that there's bound to be an element of that?
I think generally it's not deliberate, I agree. But I think we don't see enough effort to really challenge those barriers to understanding. I think it's inevitable, yes, that there are going to be complicated legal matters discussed in the course of the case that any layperson won't be familiar with. But I think professionals need to be more aware of that, make efforts to explain wherever they can, and not just enter that world of their own with their own language with no view or attention to what others are taking in.
And ultimately, that's the responsibility of whoever is in charge of the proceedings to ensure that people understand and participate. So in the magistrates' courts, it would be either the district judge or the chair of the panel of 3 magistrates to check every now and again that people are understanding, that sort of thing.
I think it's the responsibility of all professionals in the court. I think anybody who speaks in the court or works with defendants or other court users should be alert to issues of understanding. And the problem with checking is that I've seen this in the youth court particularly, which is supposed to make more efforts to ensure that young defendants can understand and engage with the process. I've sometimes seen magistrates or district judge explain who everybody is in the court and then say, do you understand? And of course a young defendant will say yes. Saying, do you understand, is not a way to really elicit insight into whether they are understanding, they are engaging. In fact, a young defendant has said to us in an interview, I was asked if I understood, and I said yes, because I didn't want to be a nuisance or look stupid.
Actually, in the reflections of the court watchers, and I read quite a few, most of the time, if the judges were checking understanding, they used exactly the same thing. They said, do you understand? and they just waited for the yes or no, as opposed to actually double checking that the person really did understand it. Because I think it's just a normal human reaction, isn't it, to go, yes.
What would be a better
Especially
way?
in an intimidating environment, which the court is. What do you two think would be a better way of doing it?
Well, I think, first of all, it's not just about checking understanding. It's about bearing in mind that understanding is an issue throughout the process, and it's about using plain language wherever possible, with the caveat that, of course, it won't always be easy. So I think the checking understanding is really the last resort in a way.
So basically, the whole process should be simplified and put into a language which people would understand. Just get in the hearings, even a trial, a defendant who has a lawyer hardly ever speaks. And CourtWatch has observed some defendants being actively silenced by the judge. Is this something you've come across?
Yes, and defendants saying they felt they weren't able to speak, that they had no part to play.
Because they felt intimidated.
Because I felt intimidated, because there weren't opportunities to speak. I mean, unless it's a trial and they choose to give evidence, they won't speak. At sentencing, again, their voice won't be heard. I mean, also, even witnesses who come to give evidence will feel that they haven't truly been heard because of the legal structures around what can and can't be heard in evidence. They'll have a story to tell about what's happened, but in practice they'll be asked very narrow questions, which is...
And they feel they can't tell their full story.
Yes, yeah.
Mm. I mean, Rosemin, we've talked a little bit about this, but obviously defendants are often nervous. They perhaps didn't expect to be there. You observed staff being, I think you wrote, overly curt, generally unfriendly with some. Tell us a bit more about that. What was going on there?
I always felt a little bit of judgment from the admin and the clerks. And before the judges and the defendant came, they would discuss the case. And they would say things like, well, I did law in so-and-so. And they would really express like the outcome and other cases that were similar or not. And I was like, why are you expressing an opinion? I was really shocked by that. It almost felt as though they had made a judgment, and they used that judgment to then, when the defendant was there, it was just very cold and unfriendly.
You also had an incident where there was security staff who kind of got into direct conflict. Can you tell that story?
So that was at Westminster Court. So there was a mother and I think I would guess a son coming for a hearing in Westminster Magistrates Court. And when I arrived, they were like sitting on the floor outside. And
they were literally sitting on the floor?
Yeah, on the cold floor. And then they sort of got up and then they asked me, are we allowed to go in? And I said, oh yeah, you can go in like, 9 o'clock, go ahead. And their treatment was shocking. It was the worst I ever saw. There were things that were being touched.
This was the security staff checking the people coming in.
Yeah, they really made a judgment about them. They weren't the most well-dressed. And the language. And I think it was about she didn't want them rifling through her bag. And it just escalated. And often in courts, when things went wrong, they really escalated very rapidly. Being a female, all the other staff were male. I just sort of said to security, let me just help and calm the situation down. But they just kept threatening them that if they didn't behave, they wouldn't be let through. And if they didn't get let through, the case would be heard without them and it would be much worse. There were lots of threatening language and opinions. And so many others gathered because they were now being accused of being aggressive.
It was a sort of shouting match, was it?
It ended up being very shouty. Lots of other security guards coming from other places and joining in, so, the power of numbers. After that incident, when the two people went in, all the security and talking to admin and the clerks, they were all having a chat about, they really shouldn't have been let in, and didn't we handle it well? And I was like, no, you didn't handle that very well at all. And then I remember seeing them later and saying, you are allowed to go out and come back in. But there was almost this fear because of, I guess, what they'd experienced on entering.
You also wrote, Rosemin, that you, quote, felt racism, especially amongst the police, but the courts appeared to be no better. What did you see that influenced that view?
When the police were witnesses, they were treated so well. There was always video evidence. The evidence was really in your face. Cases involving a black man, the police being very rough, very, very quickly they're being tackled, the man being on the floor, surrounded, and more police cars would come. And sometimes, you saw categorically the camera suddenly not working. I just always felt the judges were on the side of the police.
Against people who are black or brown?
Yeah, 100%.
But presumably there are just lots more defendants who were black or brown, or do you think that they were actually treated differently?
So number one, why are there so many black men? And the crimes listed were just... I don't really know that much about drugs, but one question the judge would ask was, I see, it's been done for possession. And the guy was like, yeah, I had a bag for my personal use. But then they would be done for having drugs. That was an additional crime added to what they were accused of. Honestly, I just thought these cases, that was so unserious. Why are they being blown out of all proportion? Honestly, I was looking for females, I was looking for white cases. I just couldn't find them. So I wondered, I can't prove it, but my experience when I CourtWatch was there were so many black men. And, they weren't aggressive, they weren't argumentative. That some of them wanted to talk when you had a chat. To me, it was just obvious I had no idea what was going on.
Jessica, you've done a lot of research in this sort of area. Does it indicate that there are sort of systematic differences in how some categories of defendants are treated by the courts compared to others?
Our own research hasn't closely examined that, but I think there's certainly plenty of criminal justice statistics that shows there is unequal treatment. The Lamy report some years ago demonstrated that.
So that was a report by Lamy, the current Justice Secretary, Lord Chancellor.
Yes, that looked at racial disparities across the criminal justice system. And it's been frequently observed that there are such disparities, particularly in sentencing. So with ethnic minority defendants more likely to receive a prison sentence, yes.
But any evidence on actually how people are sort of treated in the courts, how they're spoken to, whether they get legal representation, whether they are allowed to participate, or is that not really known about?
I think there isn't much known about that systematically. We have certainly talked to black defendants who have said they have felt treated poorly, partly on account of their race. And what's very important to be aware of, I think, is that, of course, coming into court, you don't experience a court hearing in a vacuum. That comes usually against a background of years of encounters with the police, potentially years of over-policing of ethnic minority communities, excessive use of stop and search and so on. So the court experience is often felt to be just one more episode of racially discriminatory treatment by the justice system.
And this is a big question, but it does pertain a bit to what you've said. But in terms of defendants, what kind of small things did they appreciate in terms of good treatment in the court?
It's very clear that small gestures, particularly by a judge, can make a big difference to how somebody feels about the experience of being in court. So, for example, people have said that a judge who makes eye contact with them, speaks politely, offers them a glass of water, they'll remember this afterwards, and it really affects how they evaluate their experience overall.
Whether they think they had justice.
They felt it was, the whole process was fair. Good treatment will actually impact how people feel about the justice system and the process as much as the outcome. In one of our studies where we were talking to people who'd been through the family court, we spoke to a woman who'd had the worst possible outcome in that her children were removed from her care. But she said to us, the judge said, "It's very clear how much you love those boys." And she remembered that and she quoted that to us because it really stuck in her mind. Even though, as I said, the worst had happened, being treated kindly with respect, an acknowledgement of her mother's love came through for her.
Rosemin, did you see kind treatment?
So I talked about shocked and chaos. Those were the words I used. But overall, in regards to the judges, I've sort of put, were so kind. were really listening. And you asked me earlier, Rob, you sort of said, what can we do differently? And what I loved was when a judge would say something and then say it again in the simplest language and not say, do you understand? But really take time to explain, especially during sentencing. I liked that they were aware of the background. Often people were not employed, were on universal credit or on some kind of benefit. But when there was a defendant who had a job, the judge made a real effort not to give community service, being aware that the impact would be on the family, on the children, on the partner.
So the judge made a real effort to make a sentence which wouldn't stop him working.
Yeah, and it was fair. I mean, I'm not talking about a horrendous crime. It easily could be resolved with just a fine. And I was quite shocked. I didn't realise how many fines were given as opposed to prison. Occasionally, they were in prison, they'd done their time because the sentence that was given, they'd already served their time. It had taken so long for the case to come in to court. And they literally were told, you're going home after. And there was absolute shock. And I didn't expect that to happen. I thought, no, they'll be given a few more months. So I liked the fairness when there was fairness, and when duty solicitor was excellent. They really fought. The case ran longer because they were adamant in wanting to do the best for their client. Some of them were really new, but they just, they worked so hard. They didn't have lunch. You saw them making notes and finding a room, taking the defendant there, really working hard. And I just wish everyone did that. I don't know why different solicitors vary. I just assumed there would be a professional standard, and maybe that's what we work toward.
Well, perhaps that's a good point to end our discussion on. Fascinating as ever. We end these by asking each of our guests, if you were Lord Chancellor, David Lammy as it happens, what one thing would you do to improve the treatment of defendants in magistrates' courts? What would you do, Jessica?
I would redesign the courts, the physical space, the social space and the virtual space to support participation.
OK. Rosemin, what about you?
I would get rid of the cubicle docks, have the defendants in the court, near the solicitor, facing the judge. If they have interpreters, really engaged and participating in their own process.
OK, thank you. Penelope, what would you do?
I want to have a better feedback loop for judges and lawyers and the professionals in the court. So at the moment, they do their thing, but they don't get the feedback from people watching what's going on. They don't get the feedback from defendants, witnesses, and so on. And I just think everybody benefits from a bit of feedback on how they could do it better, support people better. Rob, what about you?
Well, building on that, there used to be this body called the Courts Inspectorate. So these were inspectors who, they obviously couldn't get round every court, but they went round a sample of courts each year and actually looked at the sorts of things that your court watchers have looked at. I'd bring that one back.
Thanks, Jessica, Rosemin and Rob. And if you're interested in being a court watcher anywhere in England and Wales, we're going to start court watching again. So do sign up to the link in our programme notes. The notes also give links to our reports and to Jessica's work on courts. Thanks and goodbye.
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 Thank you. Bye.